welcome to our fourth lecture. Today we'll talk about brain anatomy. We'll talk about the individual structures of the brain and parts of the brain and what they're responsible for, and we hope that this will be helpful.
My name is Cassandra, and today we will be discussing the rough anatomy of the brain. Now, as you can see here, we have an example of the human brain, which is subdivided into three main categories. There is the forebrain, which has a lot of cortical area and is responsible for higher level functioning and thinking, and is divided into two main categories. The telencephalon, which is shown here in the light orange, and the diencephalon, which is shown here in the dark orange and has the thalamus and the hypothalamus. There's also the olfactory bulb, which is responsible for smell, which is located above the nasal cavity in this area here of the telencephalon. The next part of the brain is the midbrain, which is shown here in pink and called the mesencephalon. Then we have the most primitive and ancient part of the brain, called the hindbrain, which is shown here in purple. You have the cerebellum and the pons, and the myencephalon, which is part of the brainstem. The cerebellum and the pons are part of the metencephalon. Now, as I mentioned before, the telencephalon has a lot of cortical area and is responsible for higher level thinking and functioning. Now, this is because 80% of it is cortex, so it's associated with higher level thinking and functioning because of all its surface area. So there's a coronal section cut here, and you can see in the brain there is a ton of gyri and sulci. The gyri, shown here, look a little bit like this, and the sulci go in, as shown here. So this creates more surface area, which leads to higher level functioning. There are four major lobes that the brain is subdivided into, which are named after the bones that they reside below. There is the frontal lobe, which is located in the front of the brain, which is responsible for motor function, problem solving, memory, language, judgment, and impulse control. There is the parietal lobe, which is located up here and processes sensory information. The temporal lobe, which is by your temples, which is responsible for hearing and speaking, right here in blue. And lastly, the occipital lobe, which processes our visual sense and is located in the back of the brain.
Hi everyone, I'm Jenna, and I'm going to talk about some of the internal parts of the brain. So going from the outside in, first we have the meninges, which is basically just three outer layers of protective tissue for our brain. So the three layers are the dura mater, the arachnoid membrane, and the pia mater. So the dura mater is the tough outermost layer of the meninges. It's thick and flexible. And then we have the arachnoid membrane, which is the middle layer. It's softer and has many blood vessels contained in it. And then you have the pia mater, which is the innermost layer, and it's tough connective tissue that actually clings to the cerebral cortex. So you can see that in this image right here. On the farthest outside of our heads, we have our scalp, and then our skull, which is the bone itself. And then we have the layers of the dura mater, the arachnoid membrane, and then the pia mater, and you can see how that actually is clinging to the cerebral cortex right there. So then next we have the ventricles, which are hollow connected chambers that are filled with cerebral spinal fluid. The cerebral spinal fluid is also more known as CSF. And the cerebral spinal fluid basically is just a fluid that flows through our brains to help protect it and also get out toxins. So we have four ventricles. The first and the second are more commonly known as the lateral ventricles. You can see that right here in this scan. They're the two big ones right here that are highlighted in purple. And then we also have the third and fourth ventricles as well, but those are too small to often see on scans like this. Then we have the limbic system, which is responsible for our motivation, long-term memory, and emotion. So parts of the limbic system are cingulate gyrus, the corpus callosum, the hippocampus, amygdala, fornix, and mammillary bodies. In this image right here, you can see how they're all connected and they're all highlighted. And that's also in this image right here. So all aspects of the limbic system are connected so that way they can communicate with one another. So some parts of the limbic system include the corpus callosum, like I just mentioned. And the corpus callosum is simply just a bundle of axons that connect the hemispheres of the brain. So in this transverse slice right here, like we mentioned before, you can see the corpus callosum connecting the two halves of the brain. And then in this image right here, this mid-sagittal slice, you can see the bundle of axons right here that would connect the second half of the brain if it was present. Then you have the hippocampus, which is involved in our learning and memory. And the hippocampus is located right here within the brain. And then finally, we have the amygdala, which is responsible for our emotions and also memory, and is located right here, right near the hippocampus because of this the connection between the memory.
Hi everyone, my name is Melissa, and today I'm going to be talking about a few more parts of the brain. So to begin with, we're going to talk about the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia is composed of 3 major nuclei: the caudate, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. And here we see a larger picture of the basal ganglia, so we can see the caudate right here. The globus pallidus is this lighter pinkish circle, and then around the outside is the putamen. And then next we have the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The thalamus is responsible for being the major relay station of the brain, so it takes input in from our sensory system and sends it to the brain for further processing. There are 2 major parts of the thalamus: the lateral geniculate nucleus and the medial geniculate nucleus. The lateral geniculate nucleus is responsible for vision, while the medial geniculate nucleus is responsible for hearing. Right below the thalamus is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus controls the autonomic nervous system, is responsible for our fight or flight response, so our survival behavior, as well as the endocrine system. And right below the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland. There are 2 lobes of the pituitary gland, the anterior and the posterior. The anterior pituitary gland is a master gland, so it secretes hormones. And then the posterior pituitary gland is part of the central nervous system because projections from the hypothalamus reach into the posterior pituitary gland. And right here we can see all 3 of those parts. So here's the corpus callosum, which we talked about earlier. And then right in the center, this egg-like structure is the thalamus. Right below the thalamus is the hypothalamus, and connected to the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland. And right here is the anterior portion and the posterior portion. And lastly, we have the hindbrain. The hindbrain is composed of the cerebellum, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, also known as just the medulla. The cerebellum is responsible for standing, walking, and other coordinated movements. The pons relays information from the cerebral cortex to the cerebellum. And the medulla regulates the cardiovascular system, respiration, the GI tract, and muscle tone. So here we have the cerebellum. Cerebellum means little brain, so you can see it looks like a miniature version of the cerebral cortex. And right here we have the pons, and the medulla is right below. So we have the cerebellum projects to the pons, and then into the cerebral cortex and back, and the medulla is responsible for our autonomic system.
So finally, I would like to talk a little bit about the spine, which is part of the central nervous system, as we've discussed earlier. So the spine receives input from sensory neurons just through the dorsal horn. And here the somata of those sensory neurons that are located in our skin are located in this dorsal root ganglion. And information comes into the spine through this dorsal root ganglion. The motor neurons are located in the ventral horn of the spine, and as you can see here, the somata of those motor neurons are now are located here, and the axons are projecting out of the ventral horn of the spine. So dorsal root ganglia are the ganglia that contain the somata of the sensory neurons, and in the ventral horn of the spine, you can find motor neurons that are projecting out of the spine. And in this case here of the knee-jerk reflex, you can see the sensory input, again, here comes into the dorsal root ganglion and the dorsal horn, and then the motor output comes through the ventral horn. That concludes our series on the anatomy of the brain and the central nervous system, and we hope that this was helpful.